Hello, people of grace. For our pastoral connect today, I want to talk about just a few brief verses from the Gospel of John. This is from the English Standard Version, Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. For from his fullness, and John's talking about Jesus here, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, or the only generation of God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. So I want to take a couple minutes to talk about that because John introduces these verses with this beautiful statement. We have all received grace upon grace. And then he mentions kind of three components of this grace upon grace. First is law, but that's a bit of a contrasting statement. And then grace itself, and for John, a really big concept that can't really be separated from grace, which is truth. And the law was given through Moses. And what the law of Moses was, without taking much time to expound on it more deeply, is a treaty or a contract between God and the people of Israel. And there were a lot of different elements to it. But from the point of view of salvation, the law could not save. And really, all it did is point out how much we needed to be saved. But law is important, and God used law. And for humans, law is like a community agreement. By law, the community determines what behavior is considered acceptable or unacceptable. And if we're ever going to get along with other people, we all have to kind of figure that part out. So law is limited, but necessary. And it's hard to have a truly gracious and truth-based society if there isn't some concept of law or covenant or agreement or contract first. And God knew that, and so he used the law to prepare the way for Christ. And that's important, especially in times like this. And you see the importance of law in the New Testament, not just because it points out our need for salvation, but on just a more human level where you see the apostles, both Peter and Paul, strongly exhorting the Christians to honor the emperor, to submit to authority. And the emperor at that time was Nero, who was not someone to be emulated, but they had enough confidence and faith in God's ordaining of things and sovereignty to accept that God was at least allowing Nero to rule, and that Christians should be lawful and obedient wherever possible. And there were some times where the Christians felt compelled to disobey. For example, when they were told to not preach or to deny Christ, and they didn't feel like they could do either of those two things and obey in that way. But they were very lawful people. There's a tremendous amount of respect for law within the scriptures, not just because of its relationship to the process of salvation, but even just in the sense of allowing for societies to have peaceable lives. And that's important for us during this time. But what I really wanted to camp on was this powerful statement from John. The law came through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Really, when we just take a brief step back, it's likely the second person of the Trinity who ultimately became the human Jesus Christ, who gave the law to Moses. But it's then given through Moses as a mediator, whereas Christ himself, ultimately his being is anchored in God himself. And so the law was given really, in a sense, by Jesus, though he wasn't known as Jesus yet, to Moses, but grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. So the law is limited and was targeting the people of Israel, though there are broader applications for all humanity. As Paul says in Romans, all of us have a law written on our consciences by God, whether we have the law of Moses or not. But grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And here's kind of my big point for today. In the end, in God's eyes, though we are admonished to be lawful and should seek to be lawful, we are, by any kind of absolute standard, lawless. As John says in 1 John, sin is lawlessness. We have all sinned. And though in any kind of absolute measurement we are all lawless, God chooses to be full of grace and truth to us. Law is limited, grace and truth are universal. Law is conditional, grace and truth are unconditional, and we find them in Jesus. We find grace, or that unlimited, unmerited favor, in Jesus. We find the truth in Jesus, and those who follow Jesus should therefore be gracious always and love the truth always, even if it's an inconvenient truth related to your preferred narrative or worldview. And I believe there's always inconvenient truths related to our preferred narratives or worldviews. And so that's when we uncover those inconvenient truths that don't fit our preferred narrative or worldview. That's what tells us how gracious and truthful we really are. And in its own way, then, tells us how gracious and truthful we really are, meaning how Christ-like we really are. John then follows that statement by saying, no one has ever seen God the Father, no one has ever seen the Father, but the only God, or the only or unique generation of God, or the Old King James says the only begotten. This is that theological understanding of the eternal generation of the Word or the Son. That's what makes God known. You can't really know me well unless I communicate with you in the same way, but on a much more profound level. No one, not the highest archangel in heaven, can know the Father unless the Father chooses to express himself, which he does. And that expression of the Father, what the Father has to say, what the Father wants to communicate, is found uniquely and only and eternally in the very word of the Father, who we now know as Jesus. Jesus makes God known. Even the law cannot be properly understood without a gracious, true heart, a heart like Jesus. And even in our world today, we need to be gracious and true, even when we think people are being lawless. That's challenging. But it shows us who we're really putting our faith in. Are we putting our faith in law and human governments, or are we putting our faith in the grace and truth that are found, especially and eternally, in Jesus? Jesus is gracious and truthful to us. Let's make sure that we are gracious and love the truth and are truthful to all people unconditionally. When we're that way, we can be a source of encouragement in dark times, and that's an encouraging thought. Have a great evening.